Hopefully, you will have been through some of the tasks, particularly the Giovanni one. Looked at the what happened in that task and thought about in the role that the word processor played in that. You'll also see on that page also some other tasks that actually they work both as beginning writing, but also developing those e-literacy skills we talked about, getting people to be able to manipulate the word processor. Now, maybe you might argue that our digitally literate learners know all that kind of stuff, but it is intriguing to see how people don't know how to do things like bold, or they, that people still sort of think that you underline text in professional writing, whereas actually you use all the other different kinds of tools as well. So the second part is to look at other tools that we use for writing, and there's an interesting project that Diane and colleagues ran actually as part of this course unit a few years ago that looks at email. So if you want to pause, if you haven't looked at it already, you want to pause the video, listen to what Diane says, or if that doesn't work for you, you can sort of skim the paper and then come back, and I will then say a few additional things about that process. So what you will have seen in the paper or listened to in the recording is the way that this particular student's writing developed actually very rapidly over time. So this lad came from Mongolia, and you'll see that pretty quickly through the year his writing went from being a really very basic, his initial email was it had structure, in a sense it was paragraphs, but it grew quite considerably until he'd written quite a sophisticated text about his history, so a kind of little short story. So his skills have developed. And of course this relates, I guess, as much as anything to the particular context in which he was doing this writing. So this is in a secondary school in the UK, where he's very much immersed in language development. He's got massive amounts of input. He's going to school in English, even if his home life is still in Mongolian. So a very different kind of process, but not like most people who are learning language in the world. And you see that the actual change of the way that over the period of communication, the amount of writing back and forward changed throughout the actual process. So again, this kind of process that they engaged in encouraged the learners to actually engage with text, to produce text in that considerable way. So one of the things that we've mentioned is the way that environments for writing have changed quite significantly. We've moved away from just text processors, word processors, to being able to write in all sorts of different environments. You have PowerPoint. I mentioned desktop publishing. A tool like Publisher, for example. You've got other tools that encourage story making, and we've got all sorts of spaces where people produce text in all sorts of ways. You've got if you look at online type word processes like Google Docs, you see the way that you can very easily integrate other materials into that, hyperlinks. I mean, it's perfectly possible in Word, but there are lots of things that you can link very easily. You've got writing utilities that actually work with the text. Obviously, the obvious things like spell checkers and grammar checkers and dictionaries and translators, and these things have become quite significant in what they do. And predictive text on something like your mobile it is actually a very it can cause all sorts of fun things to occur, but if you actually pay attention to what it's doing, it can be very helpful. You've got the whole business of the web itself as a domain for publishing. We did a massive change in our notions of ownership of text and who produces text. So we've mentioned tools like Wikipedia, but there are blogs. And you've got a slowly developing practice, the practice around how you use something like a mobile for recording writing. So increasingly, what do we see? We see people maybe taking a few notes perhaps on a mobile, but increasingly taking pictures of text. So somebody, if I say in a session, oh, this is a really useful model, a lot of people get their mobiles out and take a picture of it. So rather than recording it by sort of taking notes, you record it in a different kind of way. So our notion of what we do and how we write it has changed quite considerably. We see this with something like email, where Cronenberg makes a claim that thoughts and arguments first composed in writing on email give students reflection time prior to engaging in oral work, and the quality of the argument is enhanced and thinking is more creative than without this kind of preparation. So not only do tools like word processors enable you to write more, but they actually they enable you and to write better and all of those kinds of areas, but they also can act as the spaces in which you can prepare for other skills like speaking. I mean, we've obviously already we've always got people to write dialogues and then speak them, but the ability to actually use things like text processing as part of spoken language development, so actually enabling people to text to each other in a classroom gives them the chance to actually use the support, use the mediating function of the text processor to actually improve other skills like speaking. So we have to be incredibly careful how we use the different tools, and that we don't focus too much on making it look pretty, as this cartoon kind of implies. So here are some kind of final questions for you to think about. In terms of different tools, why would you use different tools? Why would you use a wiki? Why a blog? What do they add? What affordances do they give? Increasingly sophisticated tools like, for example, Docs or Evernote. And we can ask how these tools support awareness of language knowledge, and things like genre that help us to inform the writing task. So as I've just mentioned, with using text processing to support speaking, and also whether the tools they tend to promote fluency rather than accuracy, and perhaps accuracy in writing is has become less important, perhaps. Certainly, if you look at when we think about video, we're very much more tolerant now of what would have been described very much as amateur video in the past, whereas now we're very we're very happy to look at material that's produced on a mobile phone and shot very badly, and maybe that idea is changing towards text as well. So instead of just privileging those highly edited and polished texts that we used to concern ourselves with, we're less worried about that. We're much more interested in the meaning that people make with text, and that's something certainly to think about as we go forward. So at the end of this talk, then the idea of whether we should use tools and why we should use them, sort of as new, increasingly large numbers of tools hit our screens on a daily basis. What choices do we make, and do we focus on doing things in a traditional way? Would Shakespeare have the question is, would Shakespeare have blogged in the 21st century, or would he have written his plays. So does one thing in a sense take away from another? Do we lose a writer like Shakespeare to blogging rather than having kind of the what I've been I suppose some of the most seminal plays from our history? So these things are are all part of the mix when we think about writing and technology. So I'm going to stop there, and there's a task that's set up in Blackboard for you to look at some articles and use a Google Doc to summarize them. So looking at issues to do with wikis and writing.